Hey everybody, thanks for watching my video today. If you've been following along on my website over the last few months, you'll know that I've spent a lot of time building a flop database to analyze. If you haven't been to my website, the address is below, lukic.io, and I'll link a few of the foundational posts that I've written about some of the research that I've put together in the description below. But ultimately, I've solved a variety of different flops across a variety of different formations to build a foundational data set from which I can actually analyze to try to develop a baseline flop strategy. And I'm actually often asked by people as to how do I actually do that? So how do I actually take a large data set and effectively study it to glean any insights? And what I wanted to do today was, instead of actually looking at a specific situation or a specific spot, I wanted to actually spend a little bit more time today talking about process, and specifically looking at the process by which I take to look at a lot of data and try to make some sense about it and try to visualize some key insights. And I think one of the best steps in order to do so is through really just good organization and trying to visualize data effectively. So in order to do that, what I often do at the very beginning is I try to start from a very macro level and work my way to a more granular level by segmenting and aggregating data in different ways. And in order to do that here, what I've done is I have actually built a spreadsheet or a workbook to help me through that process. So today I wanted to walk through what I've created so far and how I plan to utilize that to build the flop strategy that I've referenced and the flop strategy that I've discussed in a few of the posts that I've made so far. So that's essentially what the rest of this video is going to be about, is me walking through this spreadsheet in a little bit more detail. So I'm clicking over to the spreadsheet here, and you can see it's this workbook that I've put together with a bunch of different tabs here at the bottom, and I'll go through those tabs in a little bit more detail. But this workbook is essentially the base tool set that I plan to utilize to examine this data. And this workbook really was organized as a way to understand things at the frequency level. So my plan here is to try to examine optimal frequencies across a variety of different flop types and formations. As I mentioned here, I have a few goals. My goals are one, to try to understand equilibrium frequencies in order to determine if there are any concepts that I can extract or I can prove using this data. Number two, to determine any areas in which the player pool or we typically deviate significantly from those equilibrium frequencies, with the goal of hopefully identifying any possible exploitative situations that I can take advantage of. And then three, trying to synthesize any protocols from which I can actually simplify the majority of situations that aren't as opportune or aren't as available for EV gains, and then complicate the ones in which I can actually generate the greater exploits that can actually capture more EV. So that's what I tried to accomplish by putting this workbook together. And what I want to do today is just give a sense of what this workbook looks like, and hopefully share a little bit behind the curtain as to how I plan to generate all of this content and how I plan to actually generate this strategy. So the workbook consists of a variety of tabs below, and I'm going to go through the majority of these. The 3 tabs in blue here are kind of more aggregate and informational views, and the red tabs here are, this is ultimately the meat of the workbook here too. So we're actually going to start, before I actually dive into some of the tabs, the first thing I actually do want to look at is I'm going to unhide this data tab and just show this is the raw data from which I'm actually pulling everything from in this spreadsheet. And I can start scrolling down the screen, and you can just see this is an insane amount of data. It's just thousands and thousands and thousands of rows, and each of these individual rows represents a formation at an individual flop, and then sometimes it actually each table will represent an individual node. So for instance, this first row here represents our equity, our EV, our EQR for both out of position and in position players, as well as the frequencies for different strategic actions. In this one formation, a early position versus early position single raise pot on the flop of ace of spades, 3 of spades, 2 of diamonds, and the node of the game tree we are at is the root node, where we are this is the out of position player's turn, whereas this next table over here would be looking at, well, what happens if that out of position player c-bets, and how do we actually respond to that? And then the third table here for this formation would be, well, what if the out of position player checks? How do we respond to that? And so on and so forth. And we can actually look at, these first 3 tables are for in position defensive formations. The next tables are for out of position defensive formations. This next group is for in position offensive formations, etc. So, really this tab here is just the raw data in the form of data tables from the output we've generated from POSolver. And, like I've said, there's a lot of information and a lot of data, but how do we actually learn anything from this, right? It's a lot of data, but it can be very, very daunting to actually try to extract some insights. So that's why I've actually built this, is to help try to aggregate this data a little bit more. Now, what I've started with here is this first tab is just a summary of everything that's in this spreadsheet. So what this tab represents is essentially all of the input configurations that I put into the solvers to generate this output of data. So each of these rows are going to represent the various formations that I took a look at. So if I look at this first formation here, this is looking at single raise pots where we are in early position and we open and we are flatted by a middle position caller. It's an offensive formation. We are starting at 200 big blind starting stacks. The flop is 9.5 big blinds. So because I'm looking at live games, I'm looking at spots where we're opening to 4 big blinds. If I was looking at online games, I might lower that somewhat to 2.5 big blind opens. And then I have a range here for us, and then a range here for our opponents. And I have this for 32 different formations. So for each individual formation, you could just get a sense of some of the configurations or some of the input details that I put into solvers. And then the second tab here is just information around the flops. So for each one of those different formations, I solved it across 184 different flops. And these are the 184 different flops. If you scroll down, you can kind of see from top to bottom here. So everything from a 4-3 deuce monotone flop all the way up to an ace-ace-ace flop, and a lot of flops in between. And for each of these individual flops, I tried to characterize them by a few different ways. So some of these I've taken from other methods. So, for instance, this grouping methodology. I've seen this a few different places. I've seen this from some people within the backroom poker community. I've seen Michael Acevedo use something like this in his modern poker theory book. But it's essentially trying to categorize this based off of the how the different cards interact with one another. So you'll see here, and I can actually just look at the filters to see the different types of characterization. So I have aces are a special card, so aces are looked at separately, but then I have H representing high, and that's for kings through tens. Mediums representing nines through sixes, and then lows representing 5 through deuces. So we can take a look and categorize all flops as like a high flop would be 3 broadways that are not an ace. An ace low flop would be a triple wheel flop with an ace, and so on and so forth. So you can kind of see the different ways in which we can actually group a lot of our flops, as well as some more standard ways of characterizing these. So flop texture, which I got straight from Michael Acevedo's book, and that's taking a look at the ways I've actually organized this. Is it's a combination of the suitedness and the pairedness of a board. So is this a monotone board? Is this a paired two-tone board? Is this a paired rainbow board, a rainbow, a trips, or a two-tone board? These next two, full houses and flushes, are just a split version of that. So the full houses looks at, is this a paired board? Is this an unpaired board? Or is this a trips board? For flushes, we look at, is this a two-tone board, monotone board, or rainbow board? And then for straights, I wanted to show some level of connectiveness here. So, I basically said, is there a gut shot present on this board? Is there no straight draw present on this board? Is there an open-ended straight draw present on this board? Or is there actually a straight that could have been flopped on this board? So each of these flops, have a variety of ways that we can actually describe them. And they can represent various segments that we can actually utilize to group some of these flops together and potentially build strategies around. And on the right side here, I tried to show a look at how the whole game tree breaks out across these different types of groupings. So within these first two columns represent our 184 flop subset. So you can see here that within the 184 flop subset, 151 of them, or 82% of them, are unpaired flops. 31 of them are, or 17% are paired flops, and then 2 of them are trips flops. And we could see how that breakout looks like over flush boards, straight boards, textures, groupings, etc. And then I wanted to show, well, how does that actually also represent across all of the distinct group of flops? So we know that there's 1,755 distinct flops, and how does this allocation break out across that? And then across the full game, which is the difference between distinct flops and full games, is that ace, king, queen monotone boards, there would be that's only one distinct flop, but there's actually 4 of them, given that we have hearts, clubs, diamonds, and spades. So, if you take individual suits into account, there's actually a lot more when we actually look at the full game. So what this is really just meant to show is of our flop subset, how does our flop subset compare to the entire game? And, in some cases we are over-indexing, in some cases we are under-indexing. PioSolver actually takes that into account when aggregating everything together by weighting some of the flops differently in the aggregate rollup, but you can get a sense of just how frequently some of these different situations pop up. These high, medium, low flops are the ones that come up the most in the game, and 18%ish of flops that come up are high, medium, low flops. So it's the most frequently represented flop in the game, and we can start seeing how often different scenarios come up that can help guide us to how often they actually happen. And then the final tab in the aggregate view is this formation tab, and some of the data in this tab actually probably looks a little familiar because I just wrote 4 or 5 posts specifically analyzing this data. And this is rolling up every single flop at each of the individual formations and taking a look at what is our equity, what is our EV, what is our EQR, our equity realization, and then our strategic actions. What do they look like across each of these different formations? And I've broken this out by our in-position offense, our out-of-position offense, our in-position defense, and our out-of-position defense. And again, I'll link in the description below a link to the posts that I actually went into each of these different situations. But I found some interesting insights from actually looking at the data this way. Now, what I wanted to spend some time on now is actually looking at the rest of these tabs, which I really haven't introduced yet in any of the work that I've done. But that's where I plan on going next is taking a look at, well, what is diving deeper and taking a look into each of these individual formations. Now, you'll notice here that there are actually, let me just go through, I have 8 tabs here. And within these 8 tabs, they're actually just 2 sets of 4 tabs. I have an in-position offense macro, in-position offense micro, an out-of-position offense macro, an out-of-position offense micro, and so on for in-position defense and as well as out-of-position defense. So for each one of these 4 groups, I take a look at a macro level analysis and a micro level analysis. So I'm going to go through just one set of these just to show an example of the type of data that I plan to look at when I'm looking at each of these individual formations. And not surprisingly, it's essentially the same sets of metrics, just grouped and analyzed in at different levels of aggregation. So when I click on this macro level tab, we can see that some of these metrics here are the same. And the top 2 tables, I'll just quickly say that they're going to align to the data on the prior tab, just as a reference. So these 6 rows here for single raise pots and these 3 rows here for 3-bet pots, they're going to align to these 6 rows here for single raise pots, and then these 3 rows for 3-bet pots for the in-position offense formations, and the other formations below also represent that on the other tabs as well. So we can kind of see for each of these different formations, and I'll use this first one as an example, the early position versus small blind single raise pot example. We can see some of these metrics here from column I over are essentially the same as what we saw in the previous tab. We see our success metrics, our equity, our EV percentage, and our equity realization percentage, and then our strategic actions. So how often we expect at equilibrium villain to check to us, and then when they do check, how often we're betting large, betting small, or checking back. How often we expect villain to lead into us, and then when they do lead into us at equilibrium, how often we should be raising, calling, or folding. I've also tried to include a distribution breakout of showing how many of the 184 flops fit into these different EV percentage buckets. And EV percentage is really just what percentage of the pot do we expect to win. So, really high EV percentage pots are pots that we expect to win, over 60% of the pots. There's more often we're going to be around the 50% range. So, these kind of middle range are, between 50 and 60%, between 40 and 50%, we're going to see a larger distribution in here fairly often. And then, the worst are the pots that we actually are going to be earning less than 40% of the pot. We can see here that, clearly we're looking at in-position offense. We're virtually always going to be earning more than half the pot, which is just going to show how advantageous of a scenario that is for us. So I show this mainly to help put into context how all of the 184 flops break out from a distribution standpoint. And then I've also tried to throw a little bit of formatting to show some, to make this a little easier to actually analyze. So I have things highlighted in green or red. So any cells that are greater than one standard deviation above the average is going to be highlighted in green, within that same group at least. And then any cell that's greater than one standard deviation below the average is highlighted in red. So we can see here that within all of these formations are better ones from an equity and EV percentage standpoint are early position versus big blind. Our worst ones are when we're late position and we're flatted by a small blind. So, and again, this is all relative to one another. These first two groups here are at the high formation level. And then I have some kind of summary metrics that show, well, what does the average look like, which is less relevant for the distribution here. But you can see for some of these metrics across all of these formations, what is our average equity, EV percentage, and EQR, which, again, as well as our strategic actions, which is what we should be comparing each of these individual rows to. And then just the high versus low difference. So it's showing, the best flops, the best formations in each of these situations are, in this case here, are much better than the worst. If you see this, difference, the high versus low difference as a small number, so like EQR in this spot here, it's only 3%, we can tell that, we're really not going to be realizing equity much better or much worse in any one formation versus another at an aggregate level. So, again, just a different ways to actually just look into the data. Below, we can start seeing, this is where I think the spreadsheet becomes a little bit more valuable. And what all of this data below is actually digging into what our metrics and what our strategic action frequencies look like at the different breakouts. So I have it here for different textures. So this is the monotone, two-tone, rainbow, etc. And same thing here for unpaired, paired trips boards, boards of different suits, the straight boards, and then the grouping board. So it's the same metrics, just aggregated and grouped to different ways. Now the way to look at this is, and this is where I think that the value comes into play, is I have this drop down here. And when I open this drop down, you can see these are all of the different formations that sit within our in position offense. And I have one selected right now, big blind versus small blind. I'm actually going to just use the early position versus small blind as an example, because that was the top row. So when I select early position versus small blind, the entire spreadsheet, the data updates. And because it's pulling back off of the back-end data set, but now every single piece of data for all of these different flop characteristic types is all based on early position versus small blind formations. So I can get to the granularity of looking at, for early position versus small blind formations, what does my equilibrium frequencies look like on a monotone board? What do my equilibrium frequencies look like on a rainbow board? What do my frequencies look like on a paired rainbow board? And so on and so forth. I can look at it just from an unpaired versus paired versus trips perspective. I could look at for flushes, for different straight type boards, and then for different grouping boards. And it helps me get a little bit more granular into understand for each of these different formations, and I can click on any of these, so late position versus big blind. For each of these different formations, how do different flop textures affect, one, my overall success metrics at equilibrium, but then two, the frequencies with which I should be choosing when I'm constructing my ranges at equilibrium in these scenarios. So I've tried to represent that, and I have here as an example this kind of these I'll just kind of highlight it real fast. But this section up top here is a comparison of sorts. So when I select here, late position versus small blind, what you're going to see here is this section up here is just going to be a carbon copy of the metrics that I see when I actually highlight the late position versus small blind column. So I can show this highlighted row. These metrics are going to be the same as what I have in this up top reference point. So now when I scroll down, I can get down to the granular level of, if I'm studying a specific formation type. So for instance, in this spot here, let's say I'm studying boards that are ace high low, we'll just say ace high medium boards here in this spot. Well, I can say that the ace high medium boards in this formation are actually going to index higher than than my average equity across all, or in my average EV percentage across all board types within that formation. And as a result, we would expect our opponent to check more often than they would otherwise. We would expect us to bet a large size more often. We would expect us to check back less frequently. And we would expect our opponent to lead into us less frequently as well, too. So, this lets me take a lot of the data that I can see from the more granular views below. And this is, again, an important concept here in data exploration and data analysis is I need to understand, well, what's good and what's not good. And if I just look at this metric here alone of just ace high medium, I may look at this right away and say, okay, my equity is about 50%. That's fine. It's okay. But it doesn't really put things in the appropriate context. By comparing something to, here's what the overall average looks like for that formation, now I can understand that actually, these types of flops, these ace high medium. So an example of this might be like an ace queen 7 flop. These ace high medium flops are actually going to be more advantageous for us as the late position player versus a small blind flatter than an average flop would be. Whereas, what we might not expect, these high flops. So, this could be a flop like King Jack 10. These may be actually a little bit worse for us on average than when we are actually looking at our equity and our EV percentage than the average flop in this formation type. So again, it's a way of anchoring us to an average point so that we can compare the data that we see from different scenarios effectively. So this is the macro level view, and I think that's it's fairly self-explanatory. As I'm looking at this at a macro level, I'm not looking at any individual flops. What does the micro level view look like? And it's kind of what you'd expect, and the data is essentially the same. I am now showing the same data, but now we can look at our frequencies for every single individual flop. So from flop 1, which we looked at was the ace, all the way down to flop 184, which is the 4-3 deuce monotone, we can see one, the different flop characteristics, and then two, our different success metrics and frequencies at equilibrium compared to the overall average. Again, it gives us the comparison so that we can compare things to the overall to see is this better or worse than the average for that formation. And the value up here, it's I can change just on the previous tab. So when I change here this to something like middle position versus big blind, we can see this will change here too, and all of this data will change as well. Now, how do I actually use this? Again, this looks like a sea of data. How am I actually going to utilize this for analysis? Well, you'll notice one of the great features about Excel here is the way in which I can actually filter and organize some of this data. So if I go back to here, my micro tab here, suppose I'm studying and I'm back on my macro tab, and suppose I'm studying and I look at a specific board type. So we'll use as an example ace, my triple wheel boards with an ace. So if we're the middle position and we're playing against the big blind in a single raise pot, we can see here that on these ace low boards, we earn a higher portion of equity. Our range is a higher equity than the average spot against our opponent. We have higher EV. We actually realize a little bit less equity, and that's why our EV isn't as high. Our EV percentage isn't as high as our equity percentage is, but we still are betting this board really frequently. So we're betting this about 70% of the time here. A lot of times for a smaller sizing here at equilibrium. So suppose I actually wanted to dig into, some of the underlying data within those boards. Well, I could go to this tab here and I could use my filter to only show ace low boards. And now by doing that, I've filtered my entire workbook here down to ace low boards, and I can see the differences between. So I have some two-tone boards, I have some rainbow boards here, and within each of these, I can now look at, do I have any drastically different performing boards one over the other? And one thing, what I can see immediately here is that the rainbow boards in these situations here, I'm betting much more frequently. So I am betting these boards, this board right here, which is ace 5-3 with that's rainbow. I'm betting this about 76% of the time. On the ace 4-3 board, we're betting at equilibrium about 83% of the time. We're checking fairly infrequently here. Most of the time for the smaller sizing. On the two-tone boards, so ace 5-4 two-tone, ace 4-2 two-tone, and ace 3-2 two-tone, we're actually checking back a little bit more frequently on there. So again, that's something that we're going to look into as we get into some of our analyses. We're going to start looking into insights like that to understand, okay, well, why are we checking back a little bit more frequently on those boards with their two tones? And if we are checking back a little bit more frequently, what hands are we actually now putting into our check back range that we wouldn't have put into our check back range on the rainbow board? So again, that's just one example of the type of insight that you might generate just by looking into this a little bit more. Another thing we could do here is we can actually sort. So suppose I wanted to look at this formation and say, well, what are the best flops for me and what are the worst flops for me? So the metric that we're going to use for that is our EV percentage. So I can just take my EV percentage, which is just a measure of what percentage of the pot do I expect to win, and sort it from largest to smallest. And I can start seeing the types of boards that I'm going to earn the most on, and then the types of boards I'm going, and that's sorted all the way to the types of boards that I'm going to earn the least on. So, we can see up top some of these, if we're in the middle position and we're against the big blind flatter, the boards that we would expect to earn the highest percentage of the pot on are things like our medium low low, medium low low, medium low low, high low low, high low low. So anytime where we really expect, where we're seeing a few low cards, particularly when we have a paired board with some low cards, cards that are low enough, like a lot of the times where we have cards that are low enough that they're not necessarily hitting a large portion of our opponent's range, we're going to be realizing our equity at a significant frequency, and we're going to be able to bet those virtually always. I mean, you can see these types of boards here, we're basically checking never. So we're basically betting 100% of our range. If we sort this from smallest to largest, we can see that some of the worst boards are boards that we'd expect. These are these middling boards of 10-8-7, Jack 9-7, 10-7-6, 9-8-6, then some of the other boards like Queen Jack 9, King Queen 9, like these are boards that are actually going to be, while we're still earning more than half the pot, we are in position against a big blind caller. As compared to just the average boards in these formations, these are not nearly as favorable for us, and as a result, we're checking back at a much higher frequency. So, we can sort things, and sorry, I sort the wrong way there. We can sort things a bunch of different ways to be able to see, visually the types of boards we may be doing. Should be performing a little bit differently at equilibrium. And the rest of the workbook is essentially just a carbon copy of these two tabs. So, I have this for in position and at the macro and micro level. I can look at out of position offense, and it's the same thing. And this is just for the formations that I'm utilizing at the out of position level on offense. And the micro is the individual flops for out of position offense. And so on for in position defense as well as out of position defense. And overall, what this is meant to represent, again, is a foundation and an organizational structure by which I can actually utilize to guide me through developing my flop strategy. I don't expect to have all of the answers in here. And, certainly the spreadsheet is not going to tell me all of the answers. I'm going to have to be the one who goes through the data in order to extract key insights. But taking a structured approach like this is, in many ways, just a method by which I can actually organize my thoughts and analyze the information in a structured manner. Without taking this structured approach, I'm left with a sea of unstructured data, which is just this. And it's really, really, really hard to make a lot of sense into this and a lot of sense from this. And that's, really what I'm trying to do with this analysis is put some type of organizational structure in place by which I can actually use as a guide to keep me on the right path along the way. So, I hope this was somewhat interesting. I find this work to be fairly interesting myself. Obviously, it's really what I do on a daily basis, not just in my poker work, but in my day job. I mean, my day job as a business data analyst, I'm working instead of working in a sea of solver data, I'm working in a sea of business data, which is marketing metrics and financial metrics. And, I see spreadsheets or unstructured data that just looks, somewhat similar to the PO solver outputs. And, my job and my team's job is to segment and group and aggregate that data into meaningful ways in which we can actually extract key insights and make recommendations and develop strategies based off of that. That's what I'm doing here, and that's the approach that I'm taking with this analysis. So, I wanted to share some of this and share some of how I'm actually doing a lot of this. As I find it really interesting, and it helps to kind of uncover some of the data focused processes and what you actually might do when using a lot of data to help inform strategy and help develop some concepts and prove out some concepts as well too. So I've debated along the way packaging up this workbook and potentially selling it. I've debated potentially offering as a product, either selling the workbook as is, or even offering a solution where I could take other people could send over various ranges and various input configurations, and I can refresh this workbook using other data. If that's something that any of you might be interested in, certainly let me know. Shoot me an email, contact form on my website or in the comments below. Happy to talk through what that might look like. One of the plans which I'm actually working through now is because of the pandemic and live cache essentially being non-existent at the moment. I'm noticing that a lot of this work is based off of 200 big blind live focused ranges. I'm in the process of actually rebuilding this back-end data set just using 100 big blind stacks and online ranges, and with the goal of essentially replicating this spreadsheet at the online level. And what I the beauty of the spreadsheet itself is that the front end is only just sitting on top of the back end. So if I update the back end data tables, the whole front end will update accordingly as well too. So that's kind of what I've been working on now and what I'm working on next. But overall, I mean, I will continue to be spending a lot of time in this spreadsheet going forward. I'll be continuing trying to analyze as much of this data as I can in the best ways that I can to try to better develop my flop strategy. And then, when I get to a good point there at some point over the next few months, I plan to move on with a somewhat of a similar approach to look at turns and to look at rivers. So anyways, I hope you all enjoyed today's video. If you have any questions or comments, leave them below, whether you're looking at this on YouTube or on my website, or shoot me an email. And I'm happy to talk through any of them in more detail with any of you. So thanks again, and I hope you have a great day.